Good morning, everyone. Sitting here with me is Mrs. Venida Browder, to my left, and also her civil rights lawyer, Paul Prestia. Thank you so much for both being here. You've all seen the video. No doubt you're familiar with Kalief's case. And Kalief's case has become such an egregious example of juvenile injustice, and it's been stirring our collective consciousness and our conscience. But before Kalief was a powerful rallying cry, he was a well-adjusted, happy young man. Can you tell us a little bit about what he was like before jail, Venida?
Yes, Kalief was just a normal kid, you know. He has 5 other brothers and a sister, and playing pranks, you know, video games, Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball, just normal stuff.
And yet he spent 3 years on Rikers Island with no trial, 2 years in solitary confinement. I'm just gonna let that sink in for a second, without a trial.
Yes.
These are devastating numbers, and the conditions under which he was held were even worse. Throughout the time, he was given opportunities to plead guilty and get time served and get out, but he refused. What was it about his personality that made him refuse to plead guilty?
He didn't do it, and he stood his ground, and he wanted a trial to prove his innocence. He was a determined person, and if he felt he was right, he was going to fight for it.
And he certainly did for 3 years. Paul, tell us some of the, I mean, again, these are stark numbers, 3 years at Rikers, and yet the conditions under which he was held were barbaric.
That's an understatement, especially for what you would consider the city of New York, a progressive city like ours. And it's been well documented, the pattern and practice of abuses that have gone on in solitary confinement at Rikers Island. If Kalief was here to articulate what he had gone through by himself, Juju, I'm pretty certain that everyone in the room would be in tears. That's how powerful and how sad his ordeal was.
We're talking about he was on a gang ward. He was not a member of a gang, so he was inflicted beatings. I have some video.
Well, it's even worse than that, Juju. It's the starvation by the guards. It's the treatment by the guards that amounted to torture. I mean, they tortured him. They starved him. They didn't take him outside. They didn't take him to the shower. And I can go on and on and on.
Right.
And I think, right.
Just to bring home the point, we have some video, surveillance video of an incident that actually occurred, one of many, sadly, to Kalief. Venida, what was those 3 years like for you? You would go to court, he often wouldn't be there, you knew what was going on. What was that like for you as a mom?
It was hard. You know, I mean, when you go there for a court, each court date, I was praying, okay, today's going to be the day that they say, okay, there's no case, he's going to go home. But it didn't turn out that way. And sometime I'm sitting in court and he's not there. And normally they'll have him come, you know, appear before lunchtime. So it's lunchtime and no Kaliefs. I said, well, what happened? Oh, they didn't bring him. How could you not bring a person for their own court date? And it happened more than twice.
Paul, there were 30 delays in his trial, on his way to trial. This is almost like a waiting game that prosecutors play.
It's certainly a game, but my only conclusion that it was more than a game here, and that it was a reckless disregard by this district attorney's office to prosecute Kalief. And I can only conclude that they presumed him guilty. And this doesn't just happen in Kalief's case. This happens in every borough, in every county in this city, where the prosecutors just assume that this young man's in jail, he's probably guilty, and
they're
he's
waiting
going
for
take
him
a
to
plea.
plead guilty because they want their statistics to
Right.
be positive in terms of...
Right. And the incredible thing about this case is that this wasn't a complex case. It was a very simple case, something that any first-year prosecutor could have at least brought to court and tried before a judge or jury.
And let's talk about a lack of services. When he was let go, he was given a Metro card in the middle of the night, no mental health services. What was that like for him, Venida?
He came home, but it was Kalief, but it wasn't Kalief. He just was a different person. He was more sad, like in a dark place. He wasn't the same. The smiles disappeared. Once in a while, you'll see a little fragment of a smile.
He had classic PTSD. I mean, you described incidents where he would pace his room.
He would pace the room, the driveway. He used to walk the four corners every day. And I said, Kalief, what's the matter? He said, Ma, that's all I was allowed to do, was walk the four corners of the room. And it took months, I mean months, for him to stop that.
So
And
for 2
Juju,
years,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No, what I was just going to mention was that he was released with a Metro card, and they knew at Rikers Island he had a history of suicide attempts.
At Rikers.
Right. So the fact that they sent him home without any sort of medical or follow-up care is beyond belief. And and in Rikers Island, when he was sent, when he did get care for those suicide attempts, on the occasions that the officers actually brought him there, sometimes they sent him back into solitary.
So he had vicious beatings at the hands of gangs. He had solitary confinement for all this time. He clearly had flashbacks every day, Venida, that you described, and yet he still fought through to get his GED and to keep trying to better himself.
He was determined. He hated Rikers, and he didn't want to do anything to ever go back. He wanted to turn his life, you know, and just be, as you say, a productive citizen or whatever. And he tried. I mean, he got his GED. He took it the first time and passed. Then he enrolled into BCC, Bronx Community College. I mean, he ended his spring semester with a 3.5. Now, you took away 3 years of my son's life. Imagine what he could have accomplished if he was able to be out here getting an education like he was supposed to. He could have went far.
And yet, the depression stayed. Tell me, Paul, you have 2 lawsuits going. One is obviously the wrongful arrest, wrongful imprisonment, but there's also a wrongful death suit. Tell us about those.
Right. Shortly after Kalief's death, we filed a notice of claim with the city of New York. His parents filed it. We filed it on his parents' behalf, alleging, and I actually got the idea from Venida. And we had a conversation, I think, I don't know if it was the day that Kalief passed away, and I was at the house, or it was at the funeral, and she said, you know, it wasn't just one person that killed Kalief. It was a whole system. And this suit is sort of different than your usual wrongful death suit, where, for example, the Eric Gardner case, where the police officer puts a chokehold on him, and he dies, and he wrongfully causes death. What we're alleging here is that 3-year experience, that 3-year ordeal, especially those 2 years of solitary confinement as a teenager, that torture, and incidents like this that you just saw, that corrections officer, Vaughn Greenwich, who I should just mention is still employed by the corrections department, as far as I know, has not been disciplined and has not been arrested. That was a crime he committed. But if Commissioner Ponte's here, perhaps he can elaborate on that. In any event, I'm sorry to digress.
Venida,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And with the wrongful death, we're not only alleging that it was the city of New York and its agencies that caused his death and that time in solitary, but even afterward, because he didn't get that proper psychiatric care in solitary, they released him, and he had 3 more setbacks where he had attempted suicide and was hospitalized in psychiatric wards. And even despite that, he was released from those institutions with sporadic, minimal psychiatric care. So we could only conclude that had Kalief not been arrested, he'd be alive today. And I'm sure you're going to touch on this. President Obama abolished solitary for juveniles. He made that executive order earlier in the week. And I think what he said was, it's remarkable that he mentioned Kalief's name, of course, but he even suggested that this solitary, that time in solitary confinement, could lead to suicide.
Absolutely. Tell me, Venida, he had ups, he had downs, he was struggling. Tell us about, what led up to that horrible day.
He would go into these dark places. And when I say dark places, I mean he could be happy, like watching TV. Then all of a sudden you see him and he's like this totally different person. And you have to look and say, oh my God, what happened? But you leave him alone, because if you keep after him, then he shuts down. You know, he became a very private person, and you can't agitate him because he won't let you in anymore.
And the happy-go-lucky was gone.
And it was gone. And if he would be like that, then next thing you know, he would be happy again. But it was too many memories of what he went through. And no matter how I tried, I just couldn't get through. I'm sorry.
You
But-
never really knew.
Can't-
You never really
can't blame
knew.
yourself. You can't blame yourself. And I know you were the one who actually found him.
Yes, I was home alone with him, and we had a little discussion earlier, and I was at a loss as to what to do. I didn't know what to do, how to really, help him, because he became very paranoid, very paranoid.
Worried about getting beaten or attacked.
Yes, and I tried talking to him, so he went upstairs, and I was just laying on my bed, and he came in. He said, Ma, that was his thing. Ma, you all right? I said, yeah, I'm okay. He went back upstairs, and I hear all this moving, so I figured, he was in his brother's room. He's situating the room so he could get comfortable and watch TV. Then I hear him pacing from one room to the other, but when Kalief is upset, he paces. So I didn't pay attention. Then all of a sudden, I hear this loud noise, and I'm like, oh my goodness, a child and threw his brother's TV out the window. But I said, he can't, because there's bars. So I said, wait a minute. I go upstairs. I went in his brother's room, nothing. Then I went in the other room, and he had kicked out the air conditioner covers, and I saw this gold rope thing, and I ran downstairs, and when I opened the backyard door, one of his feet was on the bar of the gate. And I said, Kalief, stop playing. This is not a joke. It's not funny. I said, Kalief. And then I got afraid to open the door all the way in case it was my fault that he snapped. But when I looked up, his head was just hanging back. He was gone. And that loud noise was his body banging up against the house.
He had been fighting for 5 years to proclaim his innocence. I can't tell you how sorry we all are for your loss, Venida. I know we had mentioned it. Mayor de Blasio has spoken up and invoked Kalief's name. President Obama wrote about it in the Washington Post in banning solitary confinement for juveniles. Even Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy has talked about Kalief's case. And yet, to this day, you feel you've not heard an apology.
When I heard Obama, that he mentioned Kalief, I was like, oh goodness, finally. But the President of the United States acknowledged it, Mayor de Blasio and the judge, but the city won't acknowledge it. Rikers, NYPD, the judicial system, all three of them had a part in my son's death, and nobody has come forward to take the blame.
And Juju, the dichotomy there is that the city of New York has made all these reforms in light of Kalief's death. He was the impetus of those reforms. And even Mayor de Blasio, who who started some of these reforms himself, in light of Kalief's death, came out when Kalief passed away, and he gave his condolences, which was very nice of him. And then he conveniently changed his subject to mental health, saying we needed more mental health workers. When that wasn't the issue, he should have stood up and been a leader and reprimanded the officers and agencies and individuals involved. And still to this day, no one has come forward and apologized and acknowledged that this happened.
Venida, it hurts my heart to tell you that we're out of time, but I just want you to get one last answer in, which is, what is justice for you and for Kalief?
For me, justice for me and Kalief is letting them admit that they're the reason my son is dead. If he would have never been literally snatched off the street on a flimsy case that never happened, he would be here now. So I want them to admit it.
But Juju, anything at this point is bittersweet, because he's not here.
To say the very least. Paul, thank you so much. Venida, thank you for coming and sharing.
Thank you
your
for
story.
having me.
Thank you so much.